Montana. I am a symposium editor for the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Forum. We will be having our final panel right now. They will be discussing some of the lasting effects of sustainable development on urban development. And we will follow with closing remarks from our editor-in-chief, Kyle Medin. So from left to right here, we have Dr. Bree Sherwin from Texas Tech University School of Law. Then we have Professor Keith Hirokawa from Albany Law School. Then to his right, we have Senator Mike Woodard. He is a senator for the District 22. And then finally on our right, we have Heather Keefer. She's the Associate Director from Wake Up Wake County. We will start with Dr. Sherwin, and each will have between 5 and 10 minutes to talk about themselves, their titles, and what some of their ideas on lasting impacts of sustainable development, especially in urban communities. So, take the floor.
I hope no one minds if I stand up. You know, it's after lunch, and I was just telling my colleague, Professor Hirokawa, that I think better on my feet. So I'm going to stand up to introduce myself and get the panel started this way. First of all, I'd like to thank DELPF and thank Duke Law School for inviting me here. I traveled here from Lubbock, Texas today. I'm a professor of law at Texas Tech University School of Law in Lubbock, Texas. Again, my name's Bree Sherwin. And just to give you a little bit of my background, I am a cotton farmer's daughter. So I come from 3 generations of cotton farming, and where I live in Texas is not really a coastal area. It's kind of up in the panhandle. So flying out here and seeing these trees is amazing. And I agree with Nicole, by the way, you should keep the trees. I'm going to talk to you more about why a little bit later. But yeah, I come from generations of cotton farmers, and conservation has always been a really important word in our family, although I honestly come from a very conservative household. And so if you ask my father, are you an environmentalist? He would say, well, of course not. But the truth is, he very much is, because he cares about water conservation, he cares about soil health. And of course, we sit on top of the Ogallala Aquifer in Lubbock, Texas, and so we care about that water because it's a precious resource and it's running out. To give you a little bit of my background, I graduated with a dual degree in law and a master's in environmental toxicology. And so I'm also a scientist. I'm an environmental toxicologist, and I moved down and started my practice in toxic tort litigation in Dallas. So I spent a good 5 or 6 years representing communities, low-income communities, and workers in occupational health exposure cases. And so much of my time as a young attorney was spent driving around to communities in East Texas, in the Houston area, visiting Elks Lodges and signing up clients and learning their stories. And so I think that the stories from these communities is a very important part of our discussion today as well. So I spent about 9 years in Dallas practicing law, and then I moved back up into academia, finished a PhD in environmental toxicology. And so I teach at the med school as well. I'm a professor in environmental health sciences, and so I teach doctors and nurses and people getting their public health degree every spring semester as well. So my perspective is as, you know, of course, a lawyer and a scientist. And so I'm going to be talking with you a little bit today about informed decision-making, and particularly how scientists can play a role in better informing the community and our decision makers, because sometimes I feel like there really is a disconnect between the types of results, you know, the science is coming out and how that translates into policy and how it helps our environments. Most of my scholarship and my research recently has focused on environmental justice issues. I've written about trade secret protection and hydraulic fracturing, which is a big deal in Texas because we are from the energy state. So that's a continuing issue. I've written about the drinking water crisis in Flint, Michigan. And I've also worked most recently on talking about coal ash waste, which I know is an issue here in North Carolina, coal combustion residuals. These coal ash ponds are impoundments, and what do we do with them? And particularly when we have a hurricane like Hurricane Florence hit, how does that affect our communities? So You know, I'm very much looking forward to talking with you today about, climate change, weather events, and environmental contamination that occurs after, and the importance of remembering history and incorporating that into our urban development. Of course, we're not a stranger to environmental disasters in Lubbock. We were part of the Dust Bowl, which I think was one of the most major environmental disasters and crises to ever hit this country. And it was because we chose, as a country, for policy reasons with agriculture, to drastically alter the landscape, to pull up grassland, to replant it. And what did that do with our soil, our topsoil, our erosion? It drastically changed weather patterns. It affected communities. So it had far-reaching consequences. So what can we learn from history? I think that's another important part of this conversation. So I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague.
Hi, my name is Keith here. Is this the microphone? Yeah. Okay. Keith Hirokawa, I'm from Albany. I don't know if you could tell from Dr. Sherwin's comments that she's from Texas. Everything is Texas. So it shows the perspective. Yeah, she has an accent. Right? I teach law, environmental law. I focus a lot on local governments, communities, sense of place, and some such things, how environment matters. Environment is regulated from a very locationally dependent place. And we'll probably get into that obviously a little bit today, but what I want you to think about for right now is what I think is really sort of important for urban resiliency, urban sustainability, is the idea of ecosystem services, which we can talk about, but also specifically in the context of using ecosystem service analysis to think about trade-offs. And one way to get started is, have you heard of the Cuyahoga River before? Not everybody has, which I think is kind of amazing. But the Cuyahoga River is this fascinating water body, and it does what many rivers do, or at least it did, and it does again, but it flows, right? It goes from one direction, it goes somewhere else. Gravity matters and some such things. And something worth thinking about is as we settled the world as humans, sometimes we settled near water bodies because moving water courses did stuff. Right? And one of the famous favorite ones is if you throw a little bit of garbage in that water course and you close your eyes for a minute, and then when you open them up, it's gone, right? So one of the things that rivers do is it deals with waste, right? Waste disposal. And in a sense, this is something we might refer to as an ecosystem service, right? Because ecosystems work very hard in ways that benefit humans. We don't always recognize it or notice it, but they do, and we depend on them. Obviously, the particular service we took advantage of in the Cuyahoga may have been to the disadvantage of some other benefits. And by the time it burned for the 8th time, we reported that the water doesn't flow anymore. It oozes, no visible life. And in fact, it was catching on fire. And this is an example of what we might think about as trade-offs. And this is kind of what I want to briefly talk about to get us started. So ecosystem services includes both the way ecosystems produce goods, right, like bananas and building materials, timber, and some such things, but also the way ecosystems regulate the environment, like climate and water quality, and provide what we call regulating services, supporting services by sort of creating this place in which ecosystem functions can occur, and also as another category, they provide services that we refer to as cultural services. Aesthetics, recreation, spiritual attachment, some such things. So of those 4 categories, the only one that we always know how to value, right, is the goods. Because there's a shelf at some market where that thing is up there and somebody will buy it. So we can price that stuff, right, because people are paying for it in the market. But the other categories are a little tougher. Like we don't know how much to pay, and in fact we don't, pay for pollination services and other kinds of sort of pollution control and other things that are services that we really depend on, but there aren't shelves at the market for that. So we don't have to pay for them, even though they're working hard for us. And because of that, they're kind of invisible, right? They don't make their way into decisions that we make on a very regular basis. So these aspects of ecosystems are always at risk, right? We're constantly, regularly making decisions, very normal decisions, maybe to take advantage of one service such as producing goods that we're going to use. But as we make that decision, we may be displacing or disrupting other things that ecosystems do. And this is where the trade-offs analysis comes up, right? So the idea of trade-offs is to think very sincerely about the choice that we're making of the service that we want to optimize, such as agricultural choice to produce more goods, and what we're disrupting or replacing by making that choice, such as filling in a wetland to convert more land to ag use, right? So in a sense, we're optimizing the production function or service and giving up some of the more water quality or biodiversity functions that wetlands serve. They are in effect traded off. This is pretty important for a lot of reasons. One is it may help us think about which needs, which human needs and services we're prioritizing when we interact with the environment. They help us, doing the trade-offs analysis helps us figure out what the cost of our particular choices are. But probably the most important one is that when we're doing this trade-offs analysis, we're looking at very normal decisions that we make on a regular basis, and we're making those costs of the trade-off less invisible. Right? We have to account for them. So that's sort of, it's one of the areas of my research these days. And what I want to leave you with, so I don't take up too much time, and so we can get started with questions, are 5 things that I think we have to be doing to think very seriously about urban sustainability and urban resiliency in the context of ecosystem services and trade-offs. And the first is to recognize that ecosystems work very hard, right? That we have to recognize the idea of ecosystem services, where they take place, and the fact that we're benefiting only when the ecosystem is functioning, right? When the ecosystem ceases to function, we don't get the benefits anymore. The second one is pretty important. This is where we start getting sort of operationalizing some of the obviousness of ecosystem services, is that we have to start inventorying where these services take place. Where are the wetlands? Who's getting the benefit of clean water? As we start to inventory, we can start to think about where those trade-offs are taking place, whether we want to get rid of the last of our wetlands to convert to ag, or whatever the case may be. Important, I think. And actually, some of the stuff that we were hearing about in the first panel was about asset mapping, right, which is really just a way of figuring out where those cultural ecosystem services are in town. The third thing that we have to do is think a lot more seriously and functionally about how we communicate ecosystem services, right? It's a vocabulary that we don't always have access to, which is why these trade-offs and lost services are invisible. But really importantly, communicating with the public about what's going on in the ecosystem gives the public the vocabulary, and at the end of the day, we start thinking more about government accountability for those trade-off choices we make. The fourth one is make sure we're integrating these concepts, and in particular trade-offs of ecosystem services, into the way we regulate. You want a building permit? That's fine. Let's figure out which services you're displacing. And finally is our distributional question, right? Every time we start thinking about trade-offs, we're really, well, not really, but we are also talking about the distributional aspects of our decision-making, which needs are being prioritized, which communities and neighborhoods are getting the most benefit, but or which ones have to pay the most to secure that public benefit. So it's an honor to be here. Those are my introductory remarks. Thank you for being patient with me, and talk to you soon. Killing it. You're killing it.
Well, I'll break the trend.
Whatever you want.
It was a little more casual, so. Well, good afternoon. My name is Mike Woodard, and I serve in the North Carolina State Senate. My colleague, Senator McKissick, was with you on the first panel, I think, this morning. And so, I'm, again, appreciate the invitation, the chance to be with you all. I appreciate Dr. Sherwin sharing a little bit of her family story, because I grew up in eastern North Carolina, and as we say down there, who are your people? When people want to know about your family, say, who are your people? So my people came to what is now Eastern North Carolina back in 1697. So we've been farmers down in the eastern part of the state, tobacco, cotton, peanuts for a few centuries now. Like you, I suspect, I feel like the agriculture and the soil is just part of my DNA and those kinds of things as well. So if you were to ask my ancestors if they were environmentalists, they would probably say no, but they clearly were, because they cared a lot about the land, the water, the air, because that's how they made their living. I left Eastern North Carolina, came to Duke, and was an undergraduate here. Chose to make my home in Durham, and then 13 years ago joined the Durham City Council. So for 7 years I served there. So we dealt with a lot of the questions you all have talked about. Chaired the Regional Transportation Committee, as well as the liaison to the Environmental Affairs Board, Open Space and Trails, and all those kinds of things. So I was at all the intersections, if you'll pardon that bad pun, of where a lot of the issues that you talked about today came together. And then in 2012, left the City Council when I ran for the State Senate. The district I represent is, my English teacher will have to just forgive me, the most unique in, I say, the whole legislature because of both the urban and rural nature of the district. You're in the district right now, right here on the Duke campus. It includes RTP, about half of downtown Durham, both of the Duke campuses, as well as the medical center. And then from here it goes north to include Person and Caswell counties. So that means that it becomes very rural once you get out of the Durham city limits to those places up in the northern part of the district. Caswell County, for instance, is 22,000 people, spread out over a fairly sizable area. So there it becomes very rural, very agricultural. In terms of the natural resources, there's an amazing array of things that are going on there. 4 of North Carolina's 16 river basins begin in my district. Their headwaters are right there. There are literally signs that say this is the beginning of the Neuse River up in Person County. So that makes for interesting challenges. And then just Durham alone has probably among North Carolina's communities, has probably some of the largest number of intermittent streams, urban rivers, urban waterways. We have a couple of lakes nearby, man-made, which bring with them all kinds of interesting issues, Lake Jordan and Falls Lake. And then some to the north, some beautiful natural lakes as well. Dr. Sherwin also mentioned coal ash ponds. And I remember one of the most interesting days of my life was February 3rd of 2014. My assistant called me. We were not in session at the time, so I was at my office here in Durham, and my assistant called me and said, we got this urgent call from a farmer up in Caswell County. He said he'd met you, and he's very, very concerned about his cows. Well, okay, he's concerned about his cows, so what am I going to do about that? So I remembered the man, and so I called him, and I said, hey, what can I do to help you? And he said, well, listen, should my cows go down and drink the Dan River, should I let them go drink in the water? And I said, well, why not? What's different today? And I just had not heard the news that this was a Monday morning, that afternoon before that is when we had the coal ash spill in the Dan River at the Eden Power Plant up at the Duke Energy Plant in Eden, North Carolina. And so I said, has the county health department been out there? Have they done anything, posted anything? He said, no. I said, no, I would not let my cows drink the water today. So he said, well, thanks. And he went and got his cows out of the Dan River. And so I worked very carefully throughout, since then, on the coal ash spills. So while the Eden plant's not in my district, it is upstream from, my district is upstream, or downstream, I should say, from the plant. But additionally, though, I do have 2 of the largest coal ash ponds in the state in my district. So every time a storm comes, or we read another study, or we continue to test wells in that area, I just hold my breath about what the levels are going to be. So dealing with the coal ash ponds is a very critical and important issue for us. Some of the things I think a lot about are that intersection that our ancestors wouldn't agree with, but I think as their heirs today, and I think the stewards of our future environment, is where the environment and agriculture meet. And you touched on it quite a bit. And I think as policymakers, we have to have those conversations. They're going to be difficult and very tough conversations. I'm an active member of the Rural Ag Caucus in the General Assembly, and those guys from really rural parts of the state love it when I come walking into all of our meetings and actually participate and know something about it, because they say, what's that guy from Durham doing in here? But I have been a co-sponsor of the last 5 farm bills that the General Assembly's passed. But we have a lot of important issues around agriculture. If perhaps some of you have studied hog lagoons, and they are certainly prevalent in eastern North Carolina. I can't even begin to think of the myriad environmental issues, but also the myriad legal issues around hog lagoons, and that is something we as a state deal with as well. And then clean energy. My district, again, the most unique in the state. We have more solar investment than any other 50 Senate districts in the state. Again, as you drive north from here, you will find an incredible number of solar farms throughout the district. That is a very big business in my district. How do we balance that with the fact that I have those 3 Duke Energy plants in my district or just across the county line? So I'll just conclude by saying North Carolina is ground zero for a lot of these questions because of our growing clean energy industry here. We're number 2 behind California in solar, and so that's an important thing to us. Agriculture continues to be our largest industry in North Carolina. You hear so much about the rural-urban divide. I sit right on that fulcrum every day of the issues around urban and rural, agricultural environment, clean energy, dirty energy. Well, I'm sorry, coal can be clean, right? Anyway, coal, solar, you know, I sit on the fulcrum of those issues every day, and it drives a lot of my work. So I'd be happy, look forward to the dialogue with you all.
Transportation section. Wake Up Wake County is a nonpartisan nonprofit that works on growth and land use issues, so transportation, housing, water, and schools. I've been with Wake Up for 6 months and just started working on advocacy issues. And what makes me a little different on the panel today is that I've worked in state and municipal government my entire career up until recently. So I've definitely been the boots on the ground. I went to school at UNC Wilmington. When I was a freshman, we had Hurricane Fran, and I worked at the state parks as an intern and got to clean up. And then when I was a senior, we had Hurricane Floyd, and I was an intern with the Division of Coastal Management and worked on staking first lines of vegetation and seeing how communities were going to rebuild from Hurricane Floyd. Shortly after working for Coastal Management, I started my role in municipal government, worked in New Hanover County, and then soon moved to Holly Springs. I worked in Holly Springs, which was one of the fastest growing towns in North Carolina in 2000. It had very few, if any, environmental regulations at the time, and it was already seeing extreme growth. In 1990, we had roughly 800 citizens, and when I left in 2015, we had 36,000. So it was quite a difference. I worked on timbering regulations and sedimentation erosion control, stormwater, floodplain management, stream buffers, you name it. And we had to really work with the development community as we were figuring out how to grow, how to have development, and how to protect the environment. Then we also administered something called a secondary and cumulative impacts master mitigation plan. We were in the first communities in North Carolina to do this. And what this was looking at was all the other things that you're doing on the federal, state, and local level to protect the environment. When you have your direct impacts, what the other things that you're doing to protect the area since you're already growing. And we would look at this for all of our town projects, not just the big projects that would, spark the larger environmental review. I also worked at economic development and tried to help that department identify parcels that the landowners wanted to develop, then look at the environmental features on the property, and then guide the property owners and the people looking to develop the property and what measures needed to be taken for protection with making the development happen. Then after I left the town of Holly Springs in 2015, it was in the middle of a change in the way that the state was thinking about environmental regulations. And we were looking at why are we doing things? Why do we have these rules? Kind of rechecking things and seeing if we were over-regulating. And that is still something where I think there's been some cleanup as far as to make regulations more streamlined, but also I think that there's a lot of places where maybe we've taken a step back. And now, when we're really looking at larger storms and talking about resiliency, maybe we need to do another recheck. After Holly Springs, I worked for North Carolina Emergency Management. I was the National Flood Insurance Planner for Eastern North Carolina. So I helped communities from Lumberton, Fayetteville, all the way over to the Outer Banks manage their floodplain management programs responsibly. And for each county and community, it looked very different. You had some areas that were quite urban and in a riverine system where they could protect their floodplain and keep people out of it. And then you had a lot of areas were very rural, flat areas. Their government structure was different, where the communities, the towns didn't have a lot of staff. They depended on the county, and there wasn't a lot of communication back and forth. There was a lot of silos. And then you also find that even the larger municipalities like Wilmington, there wasn't a lot of discussion between departments on how they did permitting. So we worked with them to try to make sure that each community was coordinating with the right people. We also worked with them after Hurricane Matthew, and we looked at substantial damage assessments and making sure that the permitting was appropriate after the large storm event. Now that I'm with Wake Up Wake County, I'm working on many regional issues where we're looking at the big picture. A lot of our issues with growth happen on a regional level. A lot of our issues that we have with Falls and Jordan Lake they span across municipalities. So looking at one water concepts where you're looking at the economic vitality of the area, you're looking at equity and also the environment, and making sure that there's water supply for the next 50 years. And then also making sure that there's regional resiliency partnerships that people are building in the right locations. And then also looking at the big picture, like what Wake Up looks at: transportation, land use, water and housing, and schools, and making sure that they're flowing together and that density is where it needs to be, that land preservation is where it needs to be, and that we can look at all these things together to make strong, resilient communities.
Thank you, everyone. We will begin our general discussion. Please feel free to jump in at any time, build on each other's comments, and have fun with it. So, that has been kind of discussed earlier today, and even briefly in the introductions, there's obviously an interaction between human health and climate change. So I wanted to ask you what your opinions were, or what your expectations were on this interaction, and do you think that the negative impacts will resolve or intensify in the close future?
Ooh, Summer's looking at me. I guess it's my turn. Well, so we're talking about the interactions between human health, climate change, and the urban environment. And I'd really like to take that in 3 parts and talk about each of those terms because I think it's important. We are still today continuing to have this political discourse, this idea of scientific certainty sort of underpinning climate change. Do we believe that it's attributed to anthropogenic causes, human activity connected to greenhouse gas emissions? And that is very much driving the dialogue. And so I think we really need to start from a place that as a scientist, I believe there is a consensus that climate change is occurring and that human activity is contributing to that. And I think if we start from that place of agreement, which is really important, then we can get on to the other issues about talking about human health and its connection with the urban environment. Now, certainly with climate change, from a broader perspective, we have seen effects on human health. We see these extreme weather events. Certainly, it affects crop yields in a lot of different areas. We talk about communicable diseases, infectious diseases that are spreading sort of as the aftermath. And then also, because of course I'm interested in the spread of environmental contaminants, if we have flooding, which is an extreme event that is associated with hurricanes, increased hurricane strength, and particularly if we have flooding in these urban areas, then we have to look at sort of that broader connection to human health. And in most urban areas, we see quite a bit of industrialized areas. So of course, with those industries, we're going to have more hazardous waste sites. So, you know, Houston's a perfect example. It is the petrochemical heartland of the United States, right? So we have a lot of increased industry in those areas. And with increased urbanization, what do we typically see? We see, you know, the destruction of more grasslands, plowing and dredging through wetlands to do what? Put up a parking lot. Wasn't there a song lyric, Pave Paradise to put up a parking lot? Something like that. And so when you have these increased incidents of flooding, when you intensify land use, when you have more concrete, less grass, you see this spread of environmental contaminants throughout this community. And certainly that has an impact on human health. And I think we can look to Houston, Hurricane Harvey, which is fairly recent, as a perfect example. I know we can also talk about Hurricane Florence as an example, a recent example for this region locally. But, you know, in Houston, we have a city with basically 0 zoning laws. We have an increased urbanization of that area where they have continued since the early 90s to take up, I think, at least 25,000 acres of wetland and instead put in parking lots and living structures and apartments. The destruction of the Katy grassland, which is west of Houston, when you continue to just sort of indiscriminately take away these ecosystem sources, and we do have a finite amount of natural resources here, when you take those away and you replace them just indiscriminately with parking lots and concrete, that does have quite a bit of an impact on human health, because when it's situated near industrial areas, the contaminants spread much easier. You're essentially taking out that sponge. If you're taking out the trees, you're taking out the grass, there is no longer that buffer area to absorb that flooding. And so as a toxicologist, I'm concerned with this urbanization, this aspect of urbanization, without really thinking and planning about how are we going to preserve the grass, preserve the trees, preserve a functioning ecosystem within the community, yet allowing for it to grow. Just a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you for sharing those ideas.
Well, thank you. Wow.
Yeah,
I'll take
it
that
took
compliment.
most of my responsibility. So I've got a couple responses as well to that. I think, you know, this idea of where it is that human health and ecosystem health in the climate change era, what kinds of things should we be thinking about? One of them is, you know, the public services that we provide to maintain our public health, you know, our water infrastructure and some such things, water, sewer, among others. But, you know, that's one of our primary vulnerabilities, right? So 125 years ago, we were laying pipe that should have lasted 125 years. And 75 years ago, we changed to 75-year pipe. And 50 years ago, we said we can lay this pipe that's going to last about 50 years. And it's time that we got to think about, taking an inventory of whether we have any working systems left. In the meantime, we've got a variety of different kinds of sewer and water type systems. If you know anything about it, the separate storm systems versus the CSO kind of systems, and they have their own vulnerabilities, not the least of which is location. Are we going to have to move them to figure out changing storm patterns and coastal vulnerabilities and soil movement? And on top of all that, I mean, these are sort of physical issues. On top of all that, one of the things that we know, without regard for who's causing the changes in the climate, is that we've got human migration, along with climate migration and wildlife migration. You're seeing it right now in this location. Maybe it's going to keep moving north. Who knows? We know, right? But the human migration is going to demand extra capacity in our already problematic infrastructure systems, right? Do we have water? Do we have sewer capacity for the influx of new people who we didn't expect to come when we built the system? So this is one thing we need to think about. And a lot of that infrastructure is within our control. We just need to plan and fund and do it. As part of that, right, the ecosystem services component is asking us to consider the cheaper, more lasting ways that we provide for these public services through ecosystem services, right? The idea of green infrastructure that Dr. Sherwin was talking about is, if we leave some, unpaved spaces, have some plants in, but more than that, of course, but figuring out how to integrate working ecosystems into the way we manage our public infrastructure needs, we can build a better, more resilient, longer lasting, cheaper system to maintain that can provide when we need it. It's thought to be more resilient because, of course, the ecosystem can recover without our intervention a lot easier than if we have to build a new pipe system. So in this, the first issue was sort of thinking about migration and capacity with the physical aspects. Planning to integrate green infrastructure is a little bit planning for the next emergency, right? If we get rid of all of our ecosystem function, of the ones that were contributing to our infrastructure, how we're delivering clean water, we're not ready, any way you look at it, because we're going to have to build another system in response to the next emergency. I think a really important thing that we need to think about, too, is since 1969, 1970, when we started thinking about the modern era of environmental law, local governments really have been left out of that equation, sort of left to do what they're supposed to do, and every once in a while you hear good critique that local governments aren't carrying their weight because they're not doing stormwater control very effectively or some such things. And as a result, local governments don't get to participate in how we formulate federal environmental policy. And I kind of think that's a crock a little bit, right? Because when you think about who's at the center of providing clean water, we may adopt uniform standards at the federal level, but it's the public works folks that are making sure we're implementing technologies to make sure that water gets clean. And, that's where the work is happening. In fact, the big critique of we don't have the sophistication in local governments to get some of that stuff done is clearly not true. And I just want to point this out because I think it's hilarious. 2 weeks ago, I was at this meeting of this Association of Water folks, public works people, water engineers, water practitioners, and they were showing off these systems that they were developing for going way beyond sewage treatment. So you use primary and secondary cleaning systems, tertiary, we fry everything up. The water comes out of sewer systems, it's supposed to be pretty clean out of our sewage treatment. They're figuring out other mechanisms to clean it up so much that we even, not just that it's drinkable, but it also removes the stigma of having been in the sewer system. And they're shipping it off to brewers and making beer out of it. And, it's a bunch of water geeks out there having a blast, but doing the heavy lifting of making sure that we're providing for these basic systems. So I think local capacity is exactly where it's supposed to be. We've been training for this for a really long And the last thing, I'm sorry for taking too much time, but I do think something we need to think about from the very legal perspective is how we regulate our emergency responses. I mean, this is no real mystery, but generally speaking, we have emergency responses, and if it's between getting a permit and going through the process or digging a ditch to get rid of the water, we dig the ditch, right? To get the water out of town and move it somewhere else and save people's lives and some such things. And it's okay to have special procedures during emergency responses. I mean, we're sort of trained to say, here's what our problem is, focus on that, right? There's a direct cause and effect of what we're going to do to prepare. But what we have to remember is there's this very built environment, gray infrastructure sort of training to those responses. And we don't have to have that normalized in the way we do emergency response, right? Every time we dig that ditch, we separate the water course more from the floodplains, and that's the ecosystem service that helps us deal with the flood, right? So if we can, I mean, I don't have a problem with having special emergency procedures, but if our emergency procedures are a little more planted in best practices, then it justifies having emergency exemptions because it normalizes better practices for how we respond. Sorry, go ahead.
No, great. They didn't leave me a lot to say, so.
So just say with whatever you can.
Joni Mitchell, Big Yellow Taxi, 1969.
Thank
So,
you.
As the oldest person in the room, I remember that actually was a hit song. So there you go. The challenge in talking about any of these kinds of things, though, is that ultimately you got to convince the politicians who set the policy to do this. And if the politicians aren't going to believe in the science, then it ain't going to ever happen. And again, North Carolina is the prime example of this, because in 2012, we actually passed a law that told our Department of Environmental Quality that you don't rely on scientific data to make your decisions. We weren't the only state to do that, but we were probably the largest and I think most egregious of the laws, the largest state to do it and pass the most egregious of the laws. Now, when a scientist goes out and tests something, do they follow the letter of that law? Probably not. But it put North Carolina right up front as saying, hey, you know what? We're the policymakers and we just don't believe in the science here. So if I can get back in the majority, I'm going to find that that's one of the first things I'm going to do is repeal that damn law. So anyway, but because we've got to let the science drive the work that we do. If not, when it comes to not just environmental policy, but of course the related health policy around that, and then all the urban planning that's all connected, is what we tend to do, and I've seen it in my 6 years in the General Assembly, is that we play whack-a-mole with every environmental disaster, issue, challenge that comes along, and instead we should be playing Moneyball, if y'all know that movie or book. We need to be playing Moneyball. We need to let the science, the data, the research drive the decisions. Or every time another hurricane comes, Michael, Florence, Floyd, Fran, we're going to be just spending lots of money when we could have planned a lot better. I appreciate Professor Hirokawa talking about cities, because I honestly think that the most interesting work that's going on in protecting our environment, our water, sewer, and thinking about this is going on in cities now. It's not going on at the state level. Even progressive states that are doing some good work on this, like a California or in Oregon, you're finding a lot more interesting things going on in cities. I'm a big local government guy, even though I work at the state now. And so, thank God we've got progressive cities like Durham, like Raleigh, like Cary, like Chapel Hill, who are just in this region, who are thinking about this and doing that in spite of what's happening with state government. Hamilton and Madison, I think, would love to come back. Well, Hamilton is back. Why am I saying that? He's here next week in Durham. So, but the whole tension between federal, state, and local government now on these issues is fascinating to watch. The whole marble cake of this democratic republic that those guys helped create is really challenging particularly when it comes to the environmental and public health issues that we face. So thank God for cities and counties who are stepping up and pushing state and local government, even to the extent of ending up in lawsuits, either suing those other two levels of government or getting sued from the top down to come up with creative solutions to these challenges that we all face.
Well, I agree with everything that's gone through here. What I can say about our area is that, you know, the Triangle has been pretty progressive as far as protecting the environment. And it's interesting, there's been some reports out recently that there is an increase in development in the floodplain in both Durham and Raleigh, or Wake County. And it's looking back from 1990 to now, and it surprised me because since 1998, Holly Springs, the town I worked in, we didn't allow development in the special flood hazard area, the 100-year floodplain. Since 2006, we were regulating the 500-year floodplain and future conditions. So you know that for quite some time, we've been trying to keep development out of the floodplain. One thing that they did look at in the study was the 500-year floodplain, which is more restrictive, and it's something that that the NFIP doesn't regulate, so communities that would be doing a higher standard. And floodplain management is one of the places where you can have those higher standards. They haven't been taken away from us, but it's a little weird too because, you know, a couple years ago, we walked into a set of meetings and we were told that we couldn't say the word climate, we couldn't say the phrase climate change anymore. It didn't exist in our vocabulary, it just was wiped out. So you have the science, and then you have the reality that we're having these bigger storms and that people are flooding and that there's complaints and concerns, and you're trying to figure out how to convey that to the population. And you're also trying to figure out how to keep the tools you have, those higher standards that we were lucky to have when we had all this development, and tell them that it's still worth having. So a lot of them went away. Having stream buffers is very hard in a lot of communities. Some communities, like the town of Cary, has figured out that resiliency is good and that keeping people out of the floodplain also protects your stream corridors, keeps temperature down, and does a lot of good as far as filtering pollutants while being under the guise of floodplain management and keeping people safe. So it's like a dual, you know, you get the biggest bang for your buck. And so, so I think that's a strategy. And then also, when we were talking about infrastructure, you know, and larger rain events, you know, we have had some pretty significant droughts. And so we don't have a 100% reliable, you know, surface water source. And sometimes we have too much rain, and then other years we're in the opposite boat, and we're talking about having to conserve and have people shower differently and water their lawns differently and really kind of get that mindset in play. So it's very interesting that we kind of have to bobble back and forth, and you know, and then also not even getting into infrastructure and local government, conveying that, fixing those pipes. And if they're in the older areas, that, you know, it's worth it. New development and the people coming in might be paying for it, but it's needed for the community to remain vibrant and to stay as a desirable place. So there's lots of pieces and parts to it, but
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, you're fine.
I did want to comment on two things you said, which I thought were really interesting. One, the restriction, you couldn't use the term climate change in the meeting that you went into. You know, I become increasingly concerned when I see this censoring of scientific terms, like not being able to use these terms when we're talking about public health, when we're talking about environmental health, and, you know, even the scrubbing of data from websites, key environmental health studies, climate change studies that we can't find anymore, they're more difficult. When we can continue to do that, it makes it that much more difficult to have an informed discussion that turns into something productive if we can't even have access to the science, if we can't even use the correct terms. And so I agree with you. I think that's an issue. And then when we see these extreme weather patterns, when we go back and forth between, you know, the drought, which certainly we experience in West Texas, and then we, you know, the past week we have just seen torrential, just flooding and rain in Texas. We can't really have a short-sighted, you know, vision with, well, it's raining again, so we're good. So climate change, that's not really a thing, right? We had drought, but now we're good again. I think we have to look at it long-term, which, you know, I agree with you. I think that's an issue. And, you know, the long-term vision of that between the drought and the flooding is that, you know, it does change with, you know, how it informs our crops. You know, I mentioned my dad's a farmer. You know, certainly people say that a warmer climate is better. I hear that a lot in Texas. Well, we're not getting the freezes anymore. It's warmer. This is the good thing. Well, you know, for my father, it's devastating because if he doesn't get a hard freeze in the winter, then he has to spray that much more to kill the boll weevils and every type of pest that comes in and, you know, devastates the crops. So I think looking at climate change with an expansive view like that and being able to use the key terminology is really key.
Well, on the news this morning, they said that the reason why our leaves haven't changed is because we have warmer evenings. My husband was really upset because he has the map, and on mid-October, he was like waiting for orange leaves in Asheville, and they were still green. And so this morning, he was like, I told you, we have problems. So.
I think the challenge for those of us who think about these things, particularly those of us who believe in the science, is we've got to start making the economic case for this, because that very thing your husband's complaining about is the mountains. And those of you who lived in North Carolina a while, perhaps you law students have had the chance to go to the western North Carolina mountains this time of the year to see the changing of the leaves. That's a big deal to the economy in Asheville and those western counties. But if that tourist draw isn't there, the leaves aren't changing, we got to make that argument. Apples won't grow as well, and that's a big part of the economy up there as well. Listening to your conversation about the boll weevils and spraying, an issue that's been a particular concern to me is protecting our pollinators. And I wrote the Pollinator Protection Act of 2017, which is a great bill. Y'all should go check it out sometime. Award-winning legislation. I love telling people I wrote the Pollinator Protection Act. So, but you know, we've got to make the case of when we have to spray more to take care of boll weevils. What is that doing to all of the ecosystems? And we've got to make that argument with, you know, we've got to make the economic argument, I guess, is the point I'm making. So protecting our pollinators means, you know, when I hear from the farmers, well, you're going to make so I can't spray, they start listing all of the pesticides that I want to get rid of because they're killing pollinators. And I say, yeah, but you know, you keep killing the pollinators because we've lost half of our pollinator population in the last 30 years. You keep killing the pollinators, then you know what? You're not going to have any of your crops, you know, in the next 30 years. So, you know, we got to make the economic argument sometimes.
Sorry, Keith, sounds like your trip to Asheville may not be secure.
It's going to be awesome.
No foliage. So I'm going to ask.
Great leaves, but we'll tell you the good restaurants and beer joints.
So I'm going to ask one final question, and then we're going to open up to audience Q&A. So it seems like one of the big themes that we were discussing is to make sure we don't develop in areas that we need to maintain its natural presence, I guess, like the marshlands and all those other things. However, as Keith was saying, there are some areas that do need development, like we need pipes replaced and better infrastructure that's more sustainable. My question is yes, so we've discussed throughout the day that it's going to take finance and money to be able to get us to a point where we can start acting sustainable, but then we need to maintain the sustainability. We need to have people that are able to take care of the green belts. We need to have drivers for the buses and the trains. So my question to you is, how would you foresee or advise the Research Triangle, or really anywhere in the country, how they can maintain that sustainability in the urban environments? Anyone can start.
Well, you got to invest, and number one, those of you who are registered in North Carolina, vote no on all 6 amendments, but particularly the one that caps the income tax at 7%. That's bad financial policy anyway. But these governments, as I said earlier, talking about environmental policy, but it's true for municipal economic policy as well. Don't play whack-a-mole, play Moneyball. You've got to plan for these investments. We're running through a situation now, not so much on the streets right here in the Duke campus because these were developed later, but you can go just off East Campus and just off the West Campus here. Durham is going through a situation where most of the urban streets in Durham were paved 100 years ago. So the water and sewer pipes that came in were terracotta pipes, which were common at the time, and they're starting to crack. So you're seeing a lot over the last decade. You've seen an incredible amount of replacement of those pipes and the infrastructure here. And it's been a real challenge. I was on the city council when we started to address some of this. And so we developed a long-term plan so we weren't just having to do emergency funding. We actually passed a bond. I chaired the bond committee to go sell this, so I remember this very well in 2007, of convincing people that what we're asking you to, the bond is not something you're going to see right away. It's a fund that's going to go for the stuff in the ground that you'll never see. And that was a hard sell. Fortunately, we can make the business case for that. But you've got to, your elected officials have got to bite the bullet on some of these things. It's not politically popular to talk about the funding, the financing of this kind of infrastructure, because you don't get to cut a ribbon and have lots of applause when you lay, 6 blocks of new pipe through a neighborhood. Nobody that gets a warm and fuzzy from that. But when that damn pipe breaks and it's running through your yard and you're the city council member who represents that ward and you get that phone call, it's a real pain to deal with. So, we've got to bite the bullet. And as elected officials, I think we have the responsibility to get out and explain this to our taxpayers.
As far as this area is concerned in urban environments, one of the things that we're all subject to are the NPDES Phase 1 or Phase 2 stormwater rules. And when you're looking at stormwater management devices, whenever I talk about it, I always talk about the need to put them in, the need for them to be aesthetically pleasing and to be amenities to a site, and not the big hole in the back of the Walmart. But also, I really focus on when you're planning to also take into account operation and maintenance, because that's often overlooked and it's very hard to enforce if you don't think about it in the beginning. Many communities, but not all in Wake County, have a stormwater enterprise fund, and that runs their stormwater management programs, and it does some operation and maintenance of municipal stormwater devices. It does not maintain private property in most municipalities, and some municipalities, their enterprise fund is only paying for maybe half of their stormwater management costs. The rest are being paid by either the taxpayers or by development. So they really don't have enough money to maintain things in the 15, 20, 30 years when the stormwater devices were starting to see wear and tear. The city of Raleigh, they've probably been the most focused on looking at changing their unified development ordinance to incentivize and break down barriers to pick out better green infrastructure alternatives when you're looking at stormwater management. So more low impact development to make the review process easier, to even take on some of the operation and maintenance of stormwater devices in the right of way, to possibly treat areas that were already impervious that are going next to redevelopment. They have the green review, which that's called. They have the Raleigh Rainwater Rewards, which is putting stormwater devices in, people's existing homes And they have a watershed protection fee, which sets, land in different areas. And they've got a lot of different things that they're using their funds for. The other thing that we're looking at in Wake County is also the school systems, because they're required to do stormwater management, and they have the large, big ponds that they can't keep up with. One of the things that we have a problem with in Wake County is we have a lot of people moving in. We have a lot of regulations that are requiring more classrooms. So schools we're building a lot of new schools. They have the opportunity to put in really innovative green stormwater, but they don't know how to maintain it. That comes from the operating budget. And the operating budget is always falling short. And you have your teachers that are complaining that they don't have the resources and they can't vacuum the schools enough. So how are you going to ask them to maintain their stormwater devices? And these need to function to keep our watershed clean so we can have clean drinking water and we can have a supply that's going to last for the long haul.
So, sorry, did you want to?
No, you go.
So
You go
there-
and then I'll go.
All these fantastic points. I mean, I think we're hearing a lot of sort of nailed it moments in what we're getting at. And there's a pragmatic issue here about whether we're fighting over whether we call it climate change or something else. At the end of the day, doesn't matter because we're seeing migration of climates and temperatures and weather patterns and some such things. So part of this is a little bit just, I mean, we keep going on the fight about, sort of trying to figure out the sources and the causes and predict into the future and figure out what the science is so we can have an agreement to it. And in the meantime, we need to be thinking about education, right? We need to get out there and have the conversation so people understand that they're going to have to adapt their farming practices or their driving practices or whatever the practices are to a new set of circumstances. We need to think about flexibility. We need to think about a little bit how we finance it, but largely continue to finance living, but shift what living means a little bit, right? So the idea of being adaptive, right, into how we do things is a pretty important thing, and Dr. Sherwin's gonna have to talk to her dad about the frost may be gone, right? Sorry, I had something else, but it's gone.
Well, I'll make a quick comment, not about the frost, but I agree. I think he's, quickly realizing, and he's now employing water conservation practices with the way that they irrigate, which back in the 70s was just pure ditch irrigation. They would open up a ditch and just let it flow. Now we're talking about subsurface irrigation, which they even run their chemical through, and that's amazing. But I agree with you, part of this is education, and so it may be considering changing some of our terminology. One of my colleagues, Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, has been at the forefront of doing this. And it's, you've got to figure out which population you're talking to and communicate in those terms that they understand. So when I'm talking to my father, who's my father who's not the environmentalist, but the farmer, I'm not going to say, hey, Dad, you're a tree hugger, right? No, but he's proud of the fact that he's put up his own personal wind turbine in his backyard, and he funds most of his own electricity, and he's proud of his water conservation practices. And if we can find mutually agreeable terms to communicate these ideas, these concepts of conservation, the fact that the weather is changing, the better we're all going to be for it. And as far as the economics are concerned, I had the Lyft driver taking me from Raleigh-Durham or the airport to the hotel, and she goes, we've had a lot of these high-tech industries move recently into the Research Triangle, and she said it kind of feels like San Francisco, where all of the prices are going up and everything like that. And I was thinking last night, let's see, those companies have money and they have technology. And certainly they do satellite imagery, and you can translate that into geospatial analysis and combine that with epidemiological studies, and then you start identifying vulnerable groups and populations that really need that education. So you can go out and talk to those groups and say, here's what's going on in the area, perhaps identify those increased cancer rates that, if they're situated close to some sort of industry, whether it's petrochemical or coal ash waste impoundment, that, it does begin with education and in identifying those groups and starting to spread the word, I think is one of the key ways you start that.
And this panel is dedicated to Dr. Sherwin's father. So we will now open this up to audience Q&A. Kyle and Emma will come up and down the aisles with microphones. And okay, we have our first one. Well, hold on. He'll bring it to you. Take it out. Turn it on. Mostly because we are live streaming this event, so having people talk to the microphone allows our viewers from home or wherever they may be to be able to hear what everyone's saying.
My name is Huiying Fan. I'm from Nicholas School of Environment here at Duke. So I hear a lot of you talking about ecosystem services. I think it's a very good tool to kind of quantify the environmental benefits into economic terms. But then I think there is as far as I understand, there is a potential problem about ecosystem services that it's not very precise, not very accurate. That every organization, when they calculate the same ecosystem services for a same system, they got different values, and sometimes they differentiate a lot. So how is ecosystem services used in practice nowadays? Because it's not very precise how it is used by decision makers.
So fantastic question. And so since I think it was 1997 when the first big studies on ecosystem services came out, we were talking about in the teens of trillions of dollars of just wetland services alone. And it wasn't supposed to be exactly precise, right? Some of the math does have to be worked out, but a couple things to contextualize this. If you've ever tried to figure out how much a house is worth, you understand that precision is not exactly the name of the game. You get an appraisal that says 100,000, an appraisal that says 300,000, and then you start negotiating. And it's because market values can be really complicated. When it comes to ecosystem services, what we're doing with that valuation is trying to figure out the quantity, the measurable quantity of services. And usually we're picking one service instead of the one plus the co-benefits and the 18 other services that are provided. Some are very difficult to measure, such as biodiversity. Others are easier. If we lose this wetland that can filter out however many gallons of water per minute or something, then we need a filtration system that can do that, right? And we have to build it, we have to maintain it, so we can figure out how much it costs to replace those services. So in one sense, the idea of getting to evaluation has this belief that it's as close as possible to precise, recognizing that, hopefully we won't lose that service and we won't need to build that filtration service, and that cost of replacing the service also has some value. We might estimate how much it costs to build that facility, and we could be off by $100,000, right? So the lack of precision is just the way we do market, right? Now, that said, it's not it's one of the ways we use it. And in fact, in payment for ecosystem services programs, we try to figure out as close as possible how much that's worth so that we can understand valuations of replacements and substitutes and how much to pay somebody to preserve it, all those things that we're sort of creating these market forces that will determine prices. But it's not the only use for ecosystem services either. In some situations, we do valuations just to make sure we're not ignoring the cost of loss, right? So you think about urban forests are a fantastic example. We do some measurement of how much water capture and carbon capture and water filtration and biodiversity and all kinds of things that we get out of trees in the urban area. We can do this by a bunch of different measurements, canopy cover and tree type and placement, some such things, so that we can figure out this is how much sort of value, how much of a benefit to this area the one tree and the group of trees do, so that if we decide that we're just going to cut some trees, not because, because we're doing a stormwater project, but because, let's say, we want to build a house there, that's the loss, right? So we've measured the loss we get out of the service that was being provided, and we need to recognize that we're losing that service so that we're cognizant of the fact that we just may have caused a flood, or at least of that amount of stormwater control we just lost. So it gives us an estimation of what those functions are we're losing, so we know what services we're going to be short of later. It may give us some idea of, say, how to account for property rights. If all of the services are provided on one person's property, maybe we want to pay the person to not touch those, sort of do a non-use practice of property. But the other thing that I think is really kind of important is when we start thinking about ecosystem services, we start measuring the benefits, recognizing all the different benefits and trying to measure them. We have to remember that what we're doing is very locationally dependent. These are services that are provided here that have beneficiaries here. When you start thinking about how communities identify with their environment, and by the way, communities only identify by identifying with their environment because they're always placed, all of those benefits are relevant to everything that happens there, right? You trip over a rock, it's not a rock in some book, it's a rock that's right here. You go fishing in the pond down the street, or swimming there, or your route to go to work. These are the locations of here. Right? And ecosystem services is a way of really taking into account how the ecosystem functions relate to where you think you are. So in my sense, that sense of place benefit we get out of a really rigorous ecosystem service analysis isn't precise, but it gives us an awful lot of the values we may have been missing.
Do any of you have anything to add? If not,
I can't top that.
I agree.
Yes.
Yep.
is any other member? Okay. And we'll get you next.
Hey, thank you. I'm Arthur. I work at the Agroecology Education Farm in Foreign State. A question, like kind of multiple question, more about, you touched base about the long-term view and infrastructures, and I wanted to follow on that, like on a more political point of view, how is it possible to get the long-term view of sustainability in investing in infrastructure, conserving our ecosystems, and to have this fit with like the short-term growth of our cities, and we have just to build like houses as fast as we can because we cannot like cope with the amount of people coming in, and also with the short term of the political terms, like you have 2 years mandates, and you have to cope with that. And it doesn't really fit with the long-term views that we have to get for sustainability.
Boy, I mean, you've asked sort of a slightly rhetorical, but a very critical question that I don't know that there's an answer to, and that's what I think all of us are going to have to wrestle with is that balance that we find. Because I know, having sat for 7 years on just rezoning cases or development questions, a developer comes in and lays out, the tax benefit, so we're providing room for people moving in. This is how much revenue your city, your county's going to get from developing this land. And then to be able to stand there and say, no, I need to protect that land for, 100 years, not for the 30 years of this project or whatever. How do we do it? We just have to wrestle with it. I like the professors thought a lot talking about education and the political will to put in office the people who are willing to stand up for those long-term, make those long-term decisions. It's easy to say, yep, we'll rezone, we'll build in that watershed, we'll let this coal-fired plant continue to run, we won't develop solar or wind. Those are easy short-term answers. It's just a political will on the part of voters and on the part of the people they elect.
I think part of it too is just looking back to our history. I think especially now where we have sort of this short-term memory. So we have a hurricane come in, we have some sort of natural disaster, some sort of environmental disaster, and a month later, 3 months later, 6 months later, we're talking about something else because there's something more pressing. So, environmental law, the formation of environmental law has always been sort of very reactionary. So it's in response to some sort of major environmental disaster or consequence. And I don't even know if that's really happening now, but I think we can look to Houston and kind of take Houston as an example as the rebuilding after Hurricane Harvey. Are they going to go back and rebuild in the exact same way, even considering some of the problems, that they've had with flood control and taking out a lot of those natural resources? Will they choose to put green space back in? Are they going to plant more trees? Or are they just going to repave and rebuild? Do we have really an accurate picture of what those flood zones look like? Maybe some of that data needs to be updated as well. And so I think part of the solution is to not have that short-term memory, but to look to past lessons of what's happened and even sort of more of these recent environmental disasters and remember them. And, where we failed, go back and say, well, maybe we shouldn't do that again. Maybe we should rethink this and do it in a different way. And I liked Patrick on the first panel. One thing he said I just loved. We need to try and not be afraid to fail. So, we need to be willing to experiment and try some new things. And of course, I think that takes courage and, we have to talk about it as far as politics too, right? But part of it is just remembering and learning from what's happened.
And I think that one of the things too is that we have better mapping and better analysis with flood when it comes to figuring out where the floodplains are in North Carolina. And areas like Cary are working to take it to a much smaller watershed. So instead of 1 square mile, you're looking at almost at the start point. And they're starting to look at, what is the risk to infrastructure? What is the risk to their existing facilities? What is the risk to their new facilities? And what is the risk to their citizens? And then hopefully, when you find out that those areas shouldn't be where our people are, maybe that's where they protect our natural resources. And then that also can help us with our water temperature issues and our habitat connection issues. And, we can start seeing some benefits in our streams and our lakes. So I guess that's the only thing I had to add.
Yeah, I think the framework for thinking about this is natural capital, right? Is this notion that natural capital, which gives us some dividends, if we start spending the principal right off of this account, at some point we're not going to get any interest off of it, and the principal will be gone too. But I think that's the difference between what you're saying is short-term decision-making and long-term, it seems like. But I think you have to remember that crisis decision-making is always bad since the beginning of time. I mean, relationship crisis decision-making, political crisis decision-making, flood crisis. I mean, it's just something we do, and we have to figure out how to do it. There's no doubt about it. And I think one of the things that we're all struggling with on every panel here, and probably all of you as you go through school and some such things is, what's a better framework to do crisis decision-making than, oh crap, I'm in a crisis, right? So here's the problem, I'm gonna solve that problem. Or, right, non-crisis decision-making is, let's not have a problem, right? So the long-term view is set yourself up so that the thing never becomes a problem, but it's not how we do things. And that framework is tough, right? I mean, that's why we have, sustainability and equilibrium and capital and socialism. I mean, these are all frameworks to try to figure out what that best long-term goal might be. Ecosystem services is another one. Some of them are better than others, maybe, for crisis decision-making in terms of trying to get us to a better outcome. Some of them prepare us better for the next emergency. Sustainability itself is tough because we don't know what we're sustaining exactly over time, right? We have shifting baselines in the environment. We have changes that are happening. We're not exactly sure. It doesn't matter who caused it. We're not exactly sure what's going to happen in the environment tomorrow, what population migration is going to do to the services that we're trying to provide, even if we're thinking about providing the same service anymore. So, some of this has to be iterative, it has to be adaptive. That framework seems pretty good. Some of the preserving natural capital so that it can keep working at a low cost, that seems like a pretty good framework too. But I'm not sure we're going to get over crisis decision making. We just have to try to figure out how to temper it a little bit.
I'm Sean. I'm a MEM at the Nicholas School, and I had a quick question on your guys' thoughts on regulating and planning under areas of uncertainty. I think more specifically, I was thinking about this summer how, and over the past year in North Carolina, how Gen X and PFOA chemicals in the water was a really hot buzz topic, and how there was a lot of uncertainty on what is a safe level. So kind of how do you go about making decisions when we don't necessarily have all of the information?
Just to clarify, Sean, did you say PFOAs? Okay. That's a tough question. And with what we're seeing with some of the policy decisions coming out of the EPA at this point is, maybe we don't need as much science to inform how we're going to regulate PFOAs. And I think that scientific uncertainty can be used in a way that's unfortunate to risk assessment. Because if we don't let science inform those decisions, if we just say, well, we're going to guess at this risk, we think this is okay if we have a new use for a chemical, yeah, we're cool with that because it's kind of about the same. We don't need the scientists weighing in on that. Then we have a problem. So, of course, I'm going to advocate for more science versus less science. But, I think a lot of that just depends on, when we're talking about risk assessment, how informed is it going to be, particularly with PFOAs.
To add. Yeah, I mean, there are points where you have to draw the line and make the decision, and what are safe levels? I mean, do I believe that, let's take Gen X, our scientists say it's this level, but I hear a lot of other folks say, nah, it ought to be a level here. I don't really have an answer for you, but we've got to rely on the science a lot more. And sometimes we have to take those risks. We have to take the gamble on, setting those levels in there. I think we've got to be constantly, you mentioned the technology is always changing and improving. And I just think we have to commit resources to always do evaluations of those things. Do we believe that the level we set for Gen X, for instance, in the Cape Fear is still a good level? I don't know. I hear from people all the time who say, no, the level needs to be much lower than where we are. So I don't have an answer for you, but we struggle with that all the time.
I think industry and the regulators are going to have to figure out a way to work together and to make sure that when it's leaving the site, that's when you're thinking about what level it needs to be at. And you're not trying to figure out how you're going to treat it as it gets diluted and works its way into the ecosystem. I think it's very, very hard at that point.
Okay. I only have very short remarks, so we'll do one more.
Yeah, I just wanted to end on a positive note. Everybody seems to love solar power, and I've actually read that Texas is huge on solar power. And there's a component of education. If you gave every kid an iPad that was solar powered, and that would be a learned teaching moment that would do that. If you walk around Durham, you see these bicycles. These lending bicycles that are not attached to any particular station, and all of them have solar panels. And if you can afford to put them in a basket of the bicycle, you could get, you could almost give this out and make people aware that they can, capture energy in a different way. And even if the only thing that they do is they power their iPad and it becomes a hobby for kids, I think you can increase the awareness.
responses
Yeah.
to that?
Agree.
Thumbs up, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, keeping in mind that some of us grew up with calculators in 5th and 6th grade, and they were all solar powered. But then, of course, we got rid of those calculators in favor of iPhones, smartphones and stuff, and now we have to plug in our calculators for school. So it was a great idea, but maybe we need to get back to that, absolutely.
Well, I'm encouraged as well. So I'm in West Texas, and one of our biggest resources just wind. Ooh, we have a lot of wind out there. So a lot of our farmers have started leasing out their land to wind turbines and wind farms, and of course those come with some of their own environmental challenges. But we see it's interesting in Texas, in certain areas and pockets, different forms of alternative energy popping up, and it's working. Yeah.
The solar farms in this area is because a lot of the farms don't grow tobacco anymore. So, the family would love to stay on the farm. I always cite two constituents, husband and wife. He's 76, she's 74. They've lived the farm they're on. It's been in their family for over 150 years. Their kids don't live in the community anymore, but they don't want to sell the farm. They don't want to give it up. They want to stay on their farm. But they're not able to farm it anymore. They don't grow tobacco. They can't get out there and harvest tobacco or cotton or peanuts or whatever it is. So how do they stay on their land? As soon as the solar folks came knocking at their door, they signed that 20-year lease, and they're coming up for another renewal here in about 6 or 7 years. And I asked them, if you're still around, you're going to re-up. They said, oh yeah, or their heirs will. So again, same thing with your wind farmers out in West Texas. Very exciting.
Any final? If not, any final oh, yeah, one more? Okay.
Okay, to jump again on farming, how do you see the inclusion? We have like growing cities and urban areas. How do you see the fitting of ag areas, agricultural areas in the urban areas growing, and like with urban farming, or also around education and more local food systems, and getting people to know more their land and where their food comes from? How do you see that growing as a sustainable way?
I am a huge proponent of urban farming and supported a lot of work on that. And it also helps us address food deserts, which are not just in rural parts, but in urban areas as well. So again, I think it takes local policymakers who are willing to allow chickens in an urban environment. I mean, Heather will appreciate this. Trying to allow chickens in Cary was
I had them in Holly Springs.
Yeah. Holly Springs is one thing, Cary's something else. So,
Yeah, we think we're
I think you're starting to see more and more urban farming. You're seeing cities who are really taking the lead on doing that. And again, as I said earlier, God bless cities for allowing chickens and every patch of land that can be a farm, and beehives on the top of hotels, and those kinds of things that we're seeing. So it's a great move. I applaud it and do everything I can. I had to fight in the Farm Bill 3 or 4 years ago for what the definition of poultry was. You'd think that would be fairly easy, but what was the definition of poultry? So we could continue, raising poultry in urban communities like Durham, Raleigh, Cary, Chapel Hill, I was successful in fighting that, and the poultry industry loves me because they now see that that's an area where they could have real growth in the poultry industry.
The law students here would say that there's actually a lot of fight over what is considered poultry and chicken, citing Fergelment.
How about milk? Have y'all fought on that one yet?
I don't know. Everyone here has heard about the chicken case.
We had the debate on milk this summer. So.
All right.
Almond milk?
Well, if no one has any other questions, I actually have one final question.
Well, actually, just real quick, I just wanted to mention something on that.
Keith, go ahead.
So the evolution, right? So the evolution of urban areas towards more acceptance of ag type practices starts from the beginning of zoning when ag, from urban areas were zoned out of urban areas as sort of fundamentally incompatible with the kinds of residential values that urban areas were supposed to portray and some such things. But we're sort of in the middle right now of the wave away from that, of lifting. I mean, some local codes simply say agricultural practices of all these different types are per se nuisances within city centers. And what you're seeing is lifting of those nuisance declarations gradually, but speeding up as it goes across the country and some such things. So it's not the only thing, but certainly that's one of the structural limitations on integrating ag and cities, right, and urban lifestyles. But I think what's sort of interesting about it is as that's lifted from property rights as a prohibition on ways you can use your land, that doesn't answer what urban ag looks like, right? And so the jury's sort of still out. I mean, I think a lot of the constructive and creation kind of issues with what urban ag will do haven't even really hit the table yet on a lot of these local governments because they're still struggling with whether they're going to allow, which I guess is sort of maybe part of your question. But it's going to be important, right? So it's worthwhile trying to figure out, what does really successful urban ag look like? And it won't be one thing, right? It will be many things. It will be very contextual, locational. It'll involve different kinds of materials and different kinds of products and whether it's market and all kinds of stuff. But now is the time to have that conversation because it will help get to that place where urban ag is a little more comfortable. Yeah.
And I'll give one quick example just from my community of Lubbock because so we're a community of about 250,000 people, university-based, but largely ag and rural areas all around us. And so I guess we're kind of urban/rural in a way. But what I see is a wonderful collaboration between our farmers and then our city officials. So we have a wonderful group called the South Plains Food Bank. And so, of course, they collect dried goods and foods and redistribute it. But they've also started farming practices. And so a lot of our children at risk are learning farming practices and what fresh food and harvesting fresh food looks like and how to cook it. And, a lot of our farmers are coming in to kind of help with those practices and teaching those practices. And so we're seeing some really interesting collaboration there between our rural farmers and what's going on within the city.
So just to wrap up, before I begin my closing remarks, if y'all could just go down the line and like in a minute or less, just give us one action item, one thing that you think that those sitting in this room can do to go out and just start to engage with these issues. I'm going to hold you to a minute or less.
Okay. One action item, for me it is to stay informed and not just through, listening to stories via media, but to search for the truth through science, and then to use that and communicate that with other people. So I think, again, like I mentioned at the beginning when I started talking, I think there is a disconnect between what scientists are finding and what ultimately happens, as far as policy making. And so I think science can be very empowering, and I think the more that we look into that, understand that, and then communicate that with each other, educate based on that, the better decisions, we're going to have.
Yeah, education seems to be the key. I mean, educating ourselves, but that everybody knows. You ask the kid where milk comes from, and they say the grocery store, and you kind of want to pull your hair out a little bit. But that's sort of the state of knowledge in many places, and a lot of thinking through what we have to do does involve a baseline vocabulary and set of concepts that a lot of folks don't have, including folks that are making some pretty important decisions. So the fact that this tree does these things is important, right? As just a basic concept. Education, I think, is the best way to get to that baseline.
Vote and vote locally.
Think about the big picture and look at, embrace regional thoughts on planning. So there's areas where density is okay, bikeable, walkable communities with transit. And then there's areas where there can be good farming practices that are good for a healthy watershed.
All right, I want to thank our speakers for coming today. Very nice conversation. And now we're going to wrap things up with closing remarks from the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Forum's Editor-in-Chief, Kyle Medin.
Thank you so much, and thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to be mercifully brief because I know I am the last thing standing between you and your weekend. So I just want to say that it's become increasingly clear through all these great talks throughout the day that where we live, how we live, and who we are much more closely intertwined than many of us realize. When we're surrounded by highways, busy streets without sidewalks, we can get cut off from our community and from those around us. And we've seen examples of that in talks throughout the day today. Personally, I thought that this symposium was going to be a great topic to explore because I've been fascinated with the interaction between humans and our built environment and how we grow, how we spread across the landscape for several years. And I thought this was a great chance to really explore that in a local context, in a regional context. And it's really a crucial discussion. Crucial for Durham, crucial for the Triangle, crucial for North Carolina, but crucial anywhere that urban spaces exist. And as we keep going further and further into the 21st century, when there's more and more of a flock to the cities by our populations, it's going to get more and more important to find workable, equitable, and sustainable solutions to all of the problems that we've discussed today. So I think that it's a very important discussion to have. But the reason that we asked you all here today wasn't to give you a fire hose of information and just send you off into the world. We hoped that this symposium was going to be the beginning of a conversation that continues once you leave the room. We hope that at some point today you struck up a conversation with one of the folks on these panels and you asked them how you can get involved, or you traded emails, traded cards to see if you can send them a question, send them your thoughts. And we hope that you'll know now a face in the bureaucracy that can sometimes seem cold and faceless, and know where you need to go to get involved in these issues. Above all, you have a voice, but it only works when you use it. And in a very salient issue right now, the most important way that you can exercise that voice in the next week is to turn out in the midterm, which is November 6th. Voting happens on all day. Early voting is underway. We have an early voting site just up the street at the Broadhead Center. So I urge you all to, if you're interested in these issues, make sure you make your voices heard, because that's the only way that we can really keep pushing these issues forward. So again, I want to thank all of our symposium editors for all their amazing work, their really hard work on making this a success, all the staff editors for helping out. Of course, our wonderful panelists all day, they've all been fantastic. Our faculty advisors, and of course, all of you both here and watching online for taking interest in these issues. And I hope that we can continue to engage in this discussion for decades and decades. Thank you so much.